Well, welcome all once again, and as I said, I did underline a few words there from our keynote speaker, His Excellencies, and I think I would like to start off with those sentences. So first of all, it was, what I wanted to underline was our identity cannot protect us from extremism. And who would like to share their thoughts on this sentence? Harun?
I think what really happened was the post-9/11, is this on? The post-9/11 era, there was obviously understandable overreaction in the United States, having been attacked and nearly 3,000 innocent people losing their lives. But then immediately after that, there was a conflation of all Muslims with Muslim terrorists. There was a conflation of observant Muslims, conservative Muslims with radical Muslims. And these conflations continued, and what we ended up having is that all Muslims, or most Muslims, were deemed to be terrorists. And this narrative that took hold in the United States then spread to Europe. And all you had to do in the 2005, 2006, wherever you went through an airport, the biggest bestsellers on airport bookstores and every place else were anti-Islamic tracts. And then it emerged that when Mr. Obama became president, this backlash from the American white nationalists to a black man becoming president, it sort of fused all of these forces, and they eventually emerged into white nationalism, it emerged into racism, it emerged into xenophobia. And the word multiculturalism, pluralism, diversity became really Trojan horses for attacking Muslims. And the anti-immigrant sentiment that we had was really also a code word for Muslims, because most of the immigrants have been Muslims. So what we have had is really a radicalization of the public discourse. And I hold smaller liberals responsible for it, right from Mr. Tony Blair to the German leaders and even Americans, that they kept quiet. This discourse should have been challenged. These people should have been taken on, and then eventually it got out of control. And then eventually what we have social media, and what we end up getting is not only radicals, but we get extreme radicals. We get people who take a gun and go and kill. This is the sad state of affairs that we have fallen in. And this is really, and this is the last point I'll make, this is really a sad indictment of smaller liberal democracies, that they have not defended their own principles of liberalism, multiculturalism, diversity, pluralism, tolerance. I've always suspected this, that many of the smaller liberals who are not overtly anti-Muslim were going along with anti-Muslim discourse quietly. And I think this whole thing has caught up to them. And now they're trying to backpedal, and it's too late at this point.
And we will go more in depth and analysis into it. But first of all, I would still like to underline a few more things about Shefik Dizafrovich, what he mentioned in his keynote. And one of them was, apart from cooperation, he said we have to discuss cooperation. It was the labeling of religion radical. Should we open a discussion on this? Richard?
I'm always very reluctant to attach a religious denomination to a terrorist act. No more than I talk about terrorist Christians do I talk about terrorism and Muslims in the same breath. Because what we have to remember is that the huge, vast, overwhelming majority of Muslims lead good and peaceful lives contributing to society. And indeed, if you look at Britain, some of the worst of our Muslim terrorists have actually been white Christians who converted to the Muslim faith. And the biggest area of extreme Muslim belief is actually to be found in the British prison system, where radicalisation is actually encouraged because of the way in which prisons are run. The second point I'd like to make is that terrorism isn't new. What is new is the ability to communicate between different parts of the world. I mean, I've grown up during a time that's known the Baader-Meinhof gang, that's known airport hijacking, and all the time we've had to adjust the way in which we react to the threats that we have. What is now different is that the internet and communication has made it much easier for someone like Anders Breivik in Norway to be cited by someone in New Zealand as being part of the cause. Incidentally, neither of those were exactly leading Muslims. So I think we need to be cautious, and what we need to do is look for strategies to combat terrorism, not start looking for strategies to combat the Muslim faith.
When you're talking about combating terrorism, I believe last year, though, almost half of the suspected terrorists arrested in the UK were white, and the Home Office revealed those figures, and they raised a new threat level of far-right warning system, which is only introduced last year.
Yes, indeed. That was the point I made about many of these so-called Muslim terrorists not being Muslim at all, but being white Christians. And, I mean, we have a problem in the UK. There is a right movement that has fed on itself. It's fed on fantasies about migration and immigration, but it has to be combated. And on occasions, you know, you have to limit the freedoms of the individual in order to secure the wider freedom of the safety of the individual in the state. And one of the faults of the liberal intelligentsia has been an unwillingness to come to terms with the occasional need to limit personal freedom in the interests of communal freedom.
Don't blame all liberals.
You have to press.
I didn't know you were a liberal, but if you wish to wear the label, please do.
Come back to it.
Well, I will come back to countermeasures about it. Well, first, Talib Küçükcan with you. So the so-called war on terror has directly discriminated against Muslim and played a key role in disenfranchising communities on a global level. What measures can be taken to resolve this?
Well, let me say a few things about the concepts that we have been using, especially in the mainstream media, in the popular discourse, and also in the academic and think tank works. Actually, when we look at the literature developed so far and published until now, there is a focus on religiously motivated violence and terrorism. There has been very little research on far-right extremism or white supremacy and the terror activities that they were engaged in. So this is a problem that we face today. So we need to have a new understanding and maybe definition of terrorism, because until now, there has been very few discussions and debates on white supremacy, right-wing extremism, far-right extremism, and the violence, and they don't fall under the rubric of conventional terrorism that we have been discussing so far. I think now there is a new epidemic and the revival of far-right extremism under different titles, but we see that fascism of 1930s now is emerging. And that is also related with the idea of populism, etc. So from this point of view, we need to look at these concepts now, maybe in a more enlightened way, to see that, especially in the United States and in some of the European countries, most of the violent acts actually are perpetrated by the far-right movements rather than any religiously motivated people. 9/11 was a turning point in the minds of many people.
Before coming to that, maybe shouldn't it be good to understand why is there so little research and so little understanding of it on the first of all, as you just mentioned?
I think there is some kind of bias, and there is also essentialism of religion in the minds of many people. There is a monolithic perception of religion, which is very much associated with the violence. And from this perspective, 9/11 was a turning point. After 9/11, when you look at the political discourse, publications, research, and reports, most of them were related to religion in general and with Muslims in particular. And you can see how it was legitimized, the invasion of Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq, etc. So the war on terrorism became almost identical with the war on Islam and Muslims. Yes, some of the people try to disassociate war on terrorism from war on Islam, but when you look at the overall picture, there was a selective reading of the issue of terrorism, and always, as it's been mentioned by previous speakers and also by the keynote speaker, that Islam and Muslims were very frequently associated with such things, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of Muslims condemned any kind of terrorism, any kind of violence which was, carried out by the name of Islam and Muslims. And if you look at the Islamic tradition, Muslim theological works, and interpretation, the mainstream interpretation, there is no justification of violence in the name of Islam. Despite this, there is a selective reading of Islam, and there is a monolithic and essentialist perception. We are talking about 1.1 billion Muslims and more than almost 70 nation states, majority are Muslims. And yes, there are some, of course, extremists and radicalism, but the concentration was on Muslims, and I think that was also perpetuated by the mainstream media, by the political discourse. And now we are talking about, for example, some politicians, we will come to that maybe later on, they talk about Muslim question. They talk about invasion of Europe and West by Muslims, by the immigrants. So that is I think, an important ground on which some extremist ideas are emerging. But again, Islam and Muslims are always blamed. But I think now there should be some kind of awakening. If you look at Europe and elsewhere and America, most of the fatalities because of the violence perpetrated by extremists, they were all, white, maybe white supremacist, far-right movements. So the ideology is not necessarily related to any religion. So what we see when it comes to terrorism, so it is deriving and inspired by ideology, and that ideology is everywhere today. It's not only confined to the Muslim geography.
So let's take it from there, Shadi. How do we change that perception, especially governments? What can they do to tackle?
Yeah, so, in this conversation, I sometimes get a little bit nervous because we have to be careful not to repeat certain mistakes that we made in the previous war on terror, or whatever we want to call it, where we lumped in a lot of groups together and we said, all Islamists are the problem, or it's political Islam overall is the issue, without drawing distinctions between, say, ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Nahda, the PJD, and so on. So I worry sometimes that when we talk about far-right extremism, I think we can all agree in this room that anyone who incites violence against Muslims, that is a bridge too far. And I think that we can all get around that very basic idea that you can't do that and you shouldn't do that, and there's legal issues there in terms of inciting violence. But if we're looking at the rise of right-wing populism more generally, most of the parties that we're talking about participate in politics, they participate in parliament, they have representation, and they're not necessarily inciting violence. They have very problematic views. They have anti-immigrant views, anti-Muslim views, but we have to be careful not to, I think, demonize ideas. However bad or reprehensible certain ideas are, people have a right to express them, as long as they're not inciting violence. So I think making distinctions between, say, Anders Breivik and people who use violence, say in the Christchurch shootings, on one hand, and then parties like, say, the AfD in Germany, or the National Front in France, or the League in Italy, it's important to kind of keep that in mind. And I think sometimes the kind of lumping together can be, we get in some potentially problematic territory there.
So Shadi, from that I take, where do we draw the line? Well, Megan, that's a good question for you, I believe. So, as we said, the so-called dark web has provided an ungoverned space for extremists to share anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic propaganda. So how are far-right extremist groups organizing and using open source platforms to spread their ideas?
Yeah, thank you. They're definitely using those newer alt-tech, we call them platforms, to spread their ideas and grow. They're also using them, though, and I'll play off of a little bit of what the prior speaker said, they're also using them to recruit from related ideologies. So one of the things that I study is crossover between groups, between
Could you speak a little closer, Megan? I'm having difficulty.
Sorry, it's too quiet?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the things that I study is the crossover between ideologies. And so what we notice is it's not just the farthest of the far right that's violent. They're also recruiting and pulling people towards them. One of the papers that I recently wrote was about anti-Muslim sentiment in the US and how that groups that are anti-Muslim actually pull from related ideologies and become stronger that way. So that is something that we can collect data on media like the dark web or other maybe more common social media. I collect data from Telegram and Venmo, Steam, Gab, some of the smaller social media platforms, but I also collect data from Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, trying to understand this phenomenon. So building giant data sets so that we can analyze and try to detect these patterns so we can truly understand if there is a crossover between the less extreme groups and the more extreme groups.
Well, let's take it from there, Harun. And what about the role of social media? How much does it contribute when it comes to the effect of extremism?
Social media is one of the biggest culprits going at this point. And the previous two speakers have spoken about it. Talib mentioned it, and she has mentioned it as well. It is the enormity of the social media, and I think the Member of Parliament from Bosnia also mentioned it. It's the multiplication of extremist voices around the world. All you have to do is look at the numbers. Facebook and its Messenger and WhatsApp and so on between them have 5 billion users a month. YouTube has 1.8 billion users a month. These are numbers that are mind-boggling, that humanity has never known before. So if there was a radical voice somewhere, it remained contained in the village, in the region, in the nation. Now this is being broadcast around the world. And each of these terrorists, white nationalist terrorists who have gone about killing people, they echo each other and they are radicalized by this social network. The social network themselves are mostly American corporations we are talking about outside of China. They have been irresponsible all to the point of criminality because they maintain, oh, it has nothing to do with us. We are only content providers. We are not content makers. There is free speech. We are not in the censorship business. These are all plain excuses because these are the people who have been in the censorship business. They have been cooperating with security agencies. They have been cooperating with authoritative states to gain access to those markets. So they're lying, plain and simple. What they did not want to do is to spend money that is required, like newspapers do, responsible television stations do, responsible media do. You need editors, you need fact checkers, you need people who stop libeling people. You make sure that you are not crossing the line into violence and so on. These people have been irresponsible citizens and they need to be controlled and regulated, which is what the debate is at this point. Elizabeth Warren, for example, is running on a platform which clearly says Facebook needs to be broken up because it's too big, it's too bad for society. And this argument, and I agree with you, you know, where do you draw the line is a big debate in liberal democracies. What is a free idea? Of course, we want to hear free ideas and so on. But that theory works only in the abstract if, in fact, we ensure there is a countervailing argument for it. And the countervailing argument generally is missing. The right-wing voices have totally taken over the social media, mostly. They have made better use of social media than any leftist liberal organization has made in the world. And if you look at the entire picture, there is no argument that we need to draw the line. And we have had this buccaneer capitalism by these high-tech companies that have literally got away with murder, which takes you to the last point. We used to say, words don't kill. Well, if words don't kill in the abstract, that's a good principle. If words don't kill, what about the Rwandan radio station that caused a genocide? Words do lead to violence. Words do lead to mass murder and genocide. What do you think happened on Facebook in Myanmar? The campaign of genocide against the Rohingya people was whipped up by the military and the militant monks on Facebook. So we cannot simply pretend that this is not happening. there is a good argument. You know, even in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, it does not give you absolute freedom. It says free speech, yes, as much as possible, but you cannot libel people. You cannot cause violence. There is also the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution that says your right to liberty, equality of citizenship, safety, and so on and so forth. Every act is a balancing act in a democracy, but what we have done, and I fully agree with you, that we have been totally remiss in not only letting these corporations do what they've been doing, and letting the right-wingers get away with it. And I go back to my original point. Smaller liberals have a lot to answer for what has happened in the last 10, 15 years.
Well, it's all good to discuss, but it comes to the fact, how do you implement all these decisions? So before coming to that, I'm trying to use up the time wisely here, because we don't have much time, so there's a lot to discuss. We could stay on one topic for half an hour. Richard, so how has it impacted, though, the far right, the rise of the far right, essential values of tolerance, equality, and openness towards others?
I think the danger from the far right is that it tries to limit the scope where you can exist in society. And there's a lot to be said for openness and all the rest. But there's also a factor in the background here, which I discern, which is that the collapse of the former Soviet Union actually shifted the goalposts far too much in favor of capitalism. The rise of all of the irresponsibility, and not only in the media and the far right, but also in the lack of workers' rights, the way in which workers have been pushed around, the failure of the bottom 50% to get an increase in their standard of living in the last 20 years. There's been a great price that's been paid, and I can well understand the resentment and the bitterness of the people who have lost out. And I think this has been a very key point in the way society has developed. And then suddenly you get this mass media where they can fight back. And it's not just terrorism, it's also the rise of the authoritarian politician, which has often been driven forward by a sort of right-wing but welfarist approach. If you look at the approach, for instance, of the Polish government, it's actually got some of the social democratic policies of classical social democracy in giving money to the poor, but overlaying that is a quite right-wing ideology of intolerance of foreigners, intolerance of difference. So there's been a huge shift in society itself, and I'm a British Conservative. If I was living in the United States, I'd be supporting Elizabeth Warren, because I think that we need to reposition capitalism if it's to survive as a valid force.
Just a little thought.
Of course,
it's a very good point that Richard has just made. Put the finger on one of the less spoken aspects of what has happened. Unbridled capitalism, under Mr. Bush, taking away all the banking and other regulations and so on, doing away with conflict of interest rules, which had been in place for the longest time, led us to the 2008-2009 economic crash. And the whole generation of people who have been displaced by automation, by outsourcing, and by the financial collapse. Not one banker went to jail, but it's the poor people in the Midwest and elsewhere who are losing their jobs, or losing their dignity, and no hope whatsoever at the age of 55. You are a good candidate to be very angry. You are a good candidate to be hitting out at who? You want to find target. Oh, them immigrants, them Muslims. And it is this kind of uproar at the grassroots level that has not been addressed. You're absolutely right. And in terms of controlling it, regulating it, and creating some equality, because the number of people who are making billions and billions and so on, the gap is increasing like this. And the people who have been left behind make great constituency for Marine Le Pen. They make a great constituency for Geert Wilders. They make a great constituency for Mr. Donald Trump, and on it goes.
So, I believe Shadi wants a word here, we are changing the
Just to
order.
jump into something that Haroon and Richard, I think, touched on it, and I think it gets at a bigger issue. when we look at the rise of Trump or other right-wing populists, are they the problem, or are they a symptom of something deeper? And I think sometimes in the West, we just have this tendency to say Trump is bad, he's an exception, and we'll go back to normal when he's gone, and we can pretend like this never happened. But that's really missing the point, because the rise of Trump is part of a universal phenomenon. We see the rise of right-wing populists all over the world, as far as India with right-wing Hindu nationalists, in Israel with the radical right, the list Duterte in the Philippines. Something bigger is going on, and I think we should see this as a signal to all of us that there are deep structural problems that we have to address in a serious way, and the old politics of centrist technocracy, of tinkering around the margins, is not enough to address the very deep grievances that people have. People are angry for a reason. They're not just angry for the heck of it. So when we talk about Trump supporters and we say, well, they're all racist, we should just ignore them or dismiss them, then we're making a really fundamental mistake. Some of these grievances are racist, but some of these grievances are legitimate, and we have to pay attention to them.
And why do you think there's a rise, Talib, of populist leaders around the world? I add Jair Bolsonaro to that picture.
Well, I partly agree with Shahid, but I do not disagree with his previous statements on the rise of populist parties and their ideology, their views. Because when we look at the ideology of far-right extremism and also the views of the populist parties, there are a lot of overlapping issues. Yes, there are some structural problems. There is poverty in this world. There is discrimination. There is a lot of issues. The North and South, the gap is increasing in terms of income and wealth, etc. And authoritarianism is also on the rise. And the people do have grievances. We agree on that. I think there is no problem. But when you look at the other issues that the far-right extremisms and the groups are using in order to justify and legitimize their actions, we have got several issues overlapping. First of all, I would call it maybe the ideology or the views, the worldview maybe. They are all anti-pluralist, anti-universalist, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, and there is no difference, I think, between them. And they are anti-immigrant. If you look at populist parties in Europe, in many places that he has mentioned, and there's anti-immigration, and immigrants are seen as a threat, interestingly, to the European identity. And therefore, they were seen as invaders. That's why they were seen as people who are actually, these are the words which were used by populist parties. They are colonizing the West, colonizing those, enlightened civilization. What we need to do is to prevent them by erecting some walls, maybe psychological, political, legal, and now physical walls to protect our borders, to protect our identity and civilizations from Muslims, from blacks, from blah, blah. So I think there are a lot of issues that we need to address. Yes, he is right. We need to look at structural problems that are overall. I mean, maybe this is the failure of globalization. So we are talking about retreat of globalization. This is one area, because globalization is supposed to bring people together and, linking different cultures and civilizations. Yes, maybe this is happening, but on the other hand, it is creating a lot of grievances as well. In a sense, I think it is a sort of monism. That's how, maybe philosophically speaking, we can describe them. It's a political simplism that we need to look at. I mean, we cannot say, well, these are populist parties, they are legitimate parties, they are running in the elections, they are representing the parliaments. These are all rights. I mean, of course, we should have some room for all kinds of views. But one step further is extremism. And what is one step further after extremism? That is violence. When you look at Muslims and many other minorities in the West here and there, we see that now physical attacks are becoming almost a daily practice in many places. Many mosques are being attacked and ransacked. And now anti-Semitism is on the rise again. I mean, people are concerned with that. And I think populist parties should be blamed to have some responsibility on these issues.
I'd like to bring in, though, Megan. Maybe she would like to contribute to add something to it here. But especially also I would like to ask you the question, what are the trends in the dissemination of far-right and white supremacist propaganda, and how does it contrast, though, from Daesh and Al-Qaeda?
Yeah, so one of the big questions that I'm trying to understand is the media flow of propaganda through these different social media spaces. So when a manifesto is written or when a video is live streamed of a killing, how does that media spread around the world using social media? And then how does that change the behavior in the groups where the propaganda is seen? We can learn about how the groups are growing or shrinking or spreading and who is influencing whom by watching these kind of artifacts move through the global social media space. This is very different than what we might have done years ago before widespread social media, when manifestos would spread on paper, typed out copies, or you'd have to physically meet face to face. Now we see that propaganda can spread much faster, much more effectively. And so the challenge becomes what to do about that media spread, how to track it, and then watching as the players leave one system and go to another system. So one of the challenges is with encryption, and another challenge would be with uncensorable or unremovable content, so moving on to the dark web, for instance, or distributed peer-to-peer file systems. These are computer science challenges, and so we need to team up with the people who are working on the social issues so that we can work together to understand a socio-technical phenomenon at this point. This is sort of the baby stages of a problem that will be not just a political phenomenon, but will be a technical one as well.
No, I think more than a technical issue. By saying it's a technical issue, the mistake we make is we absolve Facebook and the social media behemoths from any responsibility. They create the problem, the state should fix it. I mean, that is an unequal, unsustainable proposition, because it adds more weight and more taxes and more responsibility to the state. If corporations are behaving irresponsibly, we have an option as a state to make them responsible for their content. Germany has already passed a law that says, should you produce hateful content, and if you don't take it down, we will fine you. They have come up with rules and regulations. Different jurisdictions are struggling with it. France has come up with a proposal. Elizabeth Warren, as I said, has a proposal up front. So we cannot just simply say that these people have created the problem and we should fix it. No, they should be a partner in fixing it. They should be the prime responsibility for fixing it. I just want to pick up on what Taleb said. We have this great paradox at this point. Globalization has produced enormous wealth, and it has lifted millions of people out of poverty. I think Javed was saying this yesterday from the platform. And it's a huge accomplishment for humanity that millions and millions of people have been pulled out of poverty. I'm originally from India, and you can see the change, what has happened in India. Same thing is beginning to happen in Philippines. The flip side of that is there's an immense movement of people all over the world, which has led to the next paradox, that Europe, United States, the white world is feeling threatened. The great divide, the great fault line of the West at this point is non-white immigration. We need not mince words about it. There was a time when immigrants would come to Canada, to United States and so on, and they would complain about the Irish Catholics and the Italian Catholics and the Polish Catholics and so on and so forth. But they were still white, and they were still Christian. This has been turned on its head. I mean, in Canada, 1 out of 5 people is an immigrant. In Toronto, where I live, 50% of the population is non-white. This causes immense nervousness among some people, and this is what the right wing is exploiting, which is where, again, the states have failed. Canada has been relatively free because it's a work in progress that you have to work on all the time. You have to create the consensus around pluralism. You have to create the consensus on immigration issues. You know, we had an election yesterday in Canada, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Justin Trudeau, champion of diversity, champion of multiculturalism. He was attacked mercilessly in this campaign. He barely won this morning, and he's reduced to a minority. So, which is a long way of saying color is an issue, immigration is an issue, pluralism is an issue, multiculturalism is an issue, and the people in power in liberal democracies have failed to create the consensus that is required. The flip side of it is you get a Donald Trump who whips up more white nationalism.
And yes, Shadi.
Yes, so I think a number of speakers have touched on this question of where do we draw the line, right? I get nervous when I hear that term, draw the line, because if there's a line, someone has to draw it, right? So then you have to give some group or some party or some state authority the power to decide what is acceptable speech and what is not acceptable speech. Now, if we agree with whoever that authority is, it's great. But if there's an authority making those distinctions who we don't agree with, then we get into some problems. But it gets to this bigger issue. Kander and Haroon was talking about the importance of creating consensus. We no longer have consensus in Western democracies, and I'm skeptical as to whether we can actually create a consensus. We disagree, in my own country, in America, we disagree on fundamental issues, and there's no way for one side to persuade the other about which way is the right way. So in some sense, we have to live with each other with deep differences that can't necessarily be resolved. And to me, that is really the big question of democracy going forward. If we have legitimate foundational differences over big issues, we can't pretend that there's going to be some illusion of agreement. We have to say, how do we live with those differences, right? And I think immigration is one example. Some people are going to be anti-immigrant. That's a legitimate thing for people to disagree on. I can't tell Republicans in America, you have to accept higher levels of immigration. They may disagree. And that should be within the space of democratic debate, instead of saying that everyone who wants lower levels of immigration is necessarily racist. We just can't make that argument, because that should be something we debate in a democratic setting, and there are different levels that we can that people can propose. You can't force people to be tolerant, is basically what I'm saying. People have the right, however much we might dislike it, to be intolerant. People have the right to have bad views.
Except, Shadi, the problem is this. Nobody is saying that we want to force Republicans to like immigrants. What I have talked about, what everyone talks about, is the need for leaders to provide leadership to create a consensus around certain issues. Mr. Obama tried, failed. And that is what all liberal democracies have to do. The other issue, which is more difficult, as you say, where do you draw the line on free speech? And that line is difficult to draw, but it is not impossible. The answer certainly does not lie in free speech absolutism, which is your point. Because if you have free speech absolutism, you get violence, plain and simple. I belong to PEN International, and I've sat on the international board. The founding charter of PEN, which is the writers' group, which is for free speech group, it says people are totally free to their speech and their writing, write what you will. However, it is incumbent on writers, it is incumbent on intellectuals not to feed hatred, not to advance racism. So these are, like all rights, everything is in balance. My right to move my hand must stop at your cheek. All basic rights are a juggling act or a balancing act. So I don't agree with this American free speech approach, absolutism, because that really works only in theory. It works, I'll tell you who it works for in the United States. It works for the powerful groups. It works for those who can marshal the resources. It leaves the vulnerable minorities out, and they are demonized all the time. In Canada, and also in Germany and so on, we have anti-hate laws. And our Supreme Court has held that it is reasonable to draw a line between reasonable people as to what constitutes hate. And there's a long technical definition of it. So we ought not to throw up our hands saying, can't define it, so let the right-wingers and murderers say whatever they want. No. there's a collective responsibility on society to draw these lines. Sorry.
Maybe we have to diminish all labels. But I would like to bring in again Megan here and emphasize on actually the Christchurch terror attacks, because that did open some uncomfortable truths that we had to face. So the gunman live streamed the mass murder of 51 worshippers in 2 months. Have enough action, though, been taken since then on tackling online violent extremist content, and what real changes need to be implemented?
Yeah, there was a pretty broad response to that incident, maybe on the late side, but from the social media companies trying to remove the video and the manifesto largely at the request of the New Zealand government. Subsequently, some policies were put into place at some of the social media companies that attempted to codify what they had, the technical procedures that they had done after Christchurch, so that the next shooting, which was the next live stream shooting, which was the Halle, Germany shooting, would be able to be taken care of quicker and the content removed. That was largely true, but I think the more interesting thing from a technical perspective was what happened. The second shooter, did not use the same platforms to spread the propaganda, the live stream propaganda, as the first shooter. So we're presented with the game of what I call whack-a-mole. You know, animal comes up, you hit it, comes up over here again. So you're constantly chasing this threat. It's moving persistently. And I think that is going to inform what some of the earlier speakers said about where to draw the line. I think technology may take away our power to draw the line. Technology is moving to a point where it will not be able to be censored. So we have technology already, like built on the blockchain, DLive for streaming, for example, Entropy for remonetizing demonetized content on YouTube, the dark web, IPFS is a distributed file system. These are all technologies that are in their baby stages now, but extremist groups are already using them to spread propaganda and to stay alive, to stay active, even when they've been removed from platforms. So the battle is moving. It's moving already. So that's something that technologists are keenly aware of, and we're just kind of sending out the warning signs now.
We are tight on time, Harun, so keep it very brief, please.
Yeah, the 30 seconds. The response really is we ought not to be saying technology is outpacing it, therefore we cannot do anything. That is a defeatist attitude. No, technologies are certainly outpacing and right-wingers are using it, but we can limit their exposure. Facebook need not distribute it to 5 billion people. YouTube need not distribute it to 1.9 billion people. Let right-wingers find their little niche and all 10 people can read it or 100 people can read it. The damage must be limited, can be limited, ought to be limited.
I think that can be discussed in another panel further, even for 2 hours. So, Richard, we were talking about Christchurch, then you would like to add something to it, but also, do you think it has paved the way to the uncomfortable truths to tackle the problem?
I think we are coming across some very uncomfortable truths, and the one which only a British Conservative could put forward is probably that some people in society have to regulate other people. The fact of the matter is that the middle-class judiciary in Britain is far more liberal than the population, but it's their values that I want to see perpetuated. So if we're to have a rule of law, basically it has to be the law of the people who want a reasonable society. And that means that certain things have to be entrusted to government, part of it being the pursuit of right-wing terrorism and left-wing terrorism for that matter. And you have to say to your Home Office, in our case, Internal Ministry, look, get on with it. Use your resources of the state to burst the criminal conspiracies that are out there. And every year, the British Secret Service does stop quite a number of terrorist attacks. We don't want to know how they do it in too great a detail, because we'd actually be telling the people who are perpetuating them. So, to an extent, there is actually a need for a certain amount of elitism in democracy. We should never have had a referendum. You should never put complex questions in simple terms to people. If you had a referendum in Britain on the death penalty, it would be brought back. So I say quite firmly that the middle class have a function in society, and part of that function is to control the excesses of those who don't understand the sort of society we want quite as well as we do, and beat that for an elitist statement.
Talib, would you like to contribute to that?
Right, I believe that we should not become hostage to relativism, which is, I think, the dominant views. Everything goes. This is not, I think, the right approach, because what we are trying to say here, we are not trying to limit the freedom of speech or freedom of expression when we talk about populism and far-right extremism. But what we are trying to do here is to protect our democracies, rule of law, and the constitutional organizations and institutions from the attacks of such people. And also, that is more important, we would like to save people's lives on the streets, because if we turn a blind eye to extreme terrorism, and if we do not create new kinds of mechanisms to encounter, to counter such activities, so we will see more and more people will be dying because of such things. When you look at the counter-terrorism activities, counter-terrorism legislations, and the instruments that we have today, they don't usually address white supremacy or far-right extremism. Less. If you look at all the legislations all around the world, actually, they look at religious extremism, maybe ethnically and politically motivated extremism and terrorism. They deal with it, but when it comes to collecting data, intelligence, and also if you look at availability of drones and weapons here and there, I think there's a lack of legislation, not only lack of understanding, but lack of legislation addressing such fundamental issues. Here, I think, again, I underline, because there is some kind of, I think, confusion. We are not trying to limit freedom of expression, but we are trying to look at things that might incite people for violence, which will end up in, attacking people and killing innocents.
So we only have a couple of minutes left here, and I just realized this is only the pinch of salt in the food, what we're talking about, and there's a lot more to talk about here, to uncover really. So I would like to end on a hopeful note here. So a punchline, a last sentence from each, but please keep it brief, Harun. So each of you, starting from here, please, on this panel.
I'm optimistic because collective societies are beginning to realize the dangers of Islamophobia, that Islamophobia is just a flip side of anti-Semitism. There is a collective awakening to the dangers of social media. There's a collective awakening slowly happening to the need to regulate these social media. And there is also a collective wisdom at this point that our security forces have been totally focused on Islam, Muslims, radicalism, and they have ignored white nationalists, and they are also coming to it. Democracy, things move slowly, but we are hopefully beginning to restore some equilibrium at this point.
Richard?
2 points. We have to be muscular in the face of threats to the sort of society we want. And secondly, on occasions, yes, we do have to curtail free speech, because when free speech deteriorates into hate speech, a line has to be drawn, and it has to be drawn by the state.
Thank you. Talib?
Whenever there is a terror attack by right-wing extremists, it is usually described as a lone wolf. It is usually said that this person has a psychological problem. These sort of, I think, arguments were raised. I think we need to look beyond that. There are some structural issues, as Shadi said, but there are also some ideological, inculcations that are really inciting people to violence, and also indoctrination here and there. Therefore, social media, again, some would disagree with me, it's an uncharted territory, but that it should be monitored very closely, because most of the indoctrination by religious organizations and also by white supremacy organizations are taking place on internet and in the social media. And that should be also looked, I think, very closely and carefully.
Shadi Hamid?
Yeah, so I guess you asked for something optimistic or hopeful. I lived in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, so I have a pretty dark view of human nature, and I'm generally not that optimistic anymore. I mean, I think that some of the trends in polarization that we've talked about are only likely to get worse, and we've talked about a number of factors, social media being one of them. But so I think that we can expect more identity politics, more polarization on the positive side, and maybe I'll just end with this. What does make me at least somewhat hopeful is the fact that democracies are resilient. Democracies do tend to find ways to self-correct. I think even if you look at the US case, when Trump was elected, a lot of us, including us in the American Muslim community, were very afraid. Many of us are still afraid. That said, I think American democracy has held out pretty well, and there have been checks against Trump, and Trump has been quite constrained in what he can do because we have strong institutions and strong balances. And I think that does give me some hope that we do find ways to deal with these problems.
Megan.
I guess online radicalization is real, and technology is changing to the point where we are going to need new ways to keep up with how to fight this challenge. Legal frameworks may not be enough. Traditional policy frameworks probably won't be able to address the way technology is decentralizing and making things uncensorable at this point. There will be no authorities to appeal to remove content. So with that in mind, we need to invest in research and real understanding of how this technology works and the impact that it will have on the continuing rise of extremism. So.
Well, thank you very much all. It was very interesting for me. I hope it was interesting for everyone listening. I would like to thank, first of all, our keynote speaker, Bosniak member of the Presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Šefik Tisafrofovic, and also our guest here, Megan Squire, Shadi Hamid, Talib Küçükcan, Richard Balfe, and Harun Siddiqui. Thank you very much.